You don't feel addicted. That's the problem. Because addiction, in your mind, has a very specific shape. It looks like loss of control, like chaos, like something obvious. This doesn't look like that. This looks like a normal day. You wake up, check your phone, just for a second. Nothing dramatic. No decision being made. Just a small movement of the thumb. And somehow, you're already consuming something before you even remember who you are that morning. It doesn't stop there. You eat while watching something. You scroll while waiting. You switch tabs while working. You open apps without thinking. Not because you decided to, because there's a gap, and the brain doesn't tolerate gaps anymore. That's the part no one tells you. You didn't lose discipline. Your brain lost its tolerance for stillness. There was a time when boredom existed, when waiting in line meant waiting, when sitting alone meant thinking, when doing nothing wasn't uncomfortable. Now it feels wrong, almost threatening, like something is missing. So you fill it again and again and again. But here's what's actually happening, not on the surface. Underneath, every time you reach for stimulation, your brain registers a reward, not because the content is meaningful, but because it's immediate, fast, effortless, predictable, and your brain adapts. Quietly, relentlessly, it starts raising the baseline. What used to feel like enough doesn't feel like anything anymore. Silence becomes empty. Focus becomes heavy. Simple tasks become slow. Too slow. So you compensate. More input, more switching, more stimulation. Not because you want to, because everything else feels flat. This is where most people get it wrong. They think they lack motivation. They don't. They've trained their brain to reject anything that doesn't give instant feedback. Reading a book? Too slow. Working on something long-term? No immediate reward. Sitting with your own thoughts? Uncomfortable. Not because these things are inherently difficult, but because they don't match the speed your brain is now used to. And this doesn't feel like a problem at first, because you're still functioning. You still go through your day. You still do what needs to be done. But something is off. Subtle. Persistent. You start things and don't finish them. You feel tired without doing anything physically demanding. You open your phone without knowing why. You look for something, but nothing feels right. That's the signal. Not loud, not dramatic, just constant. And the worst part is, you think it's you, your personality, your discipline, your inconsistency. It's not. It's conditioning. You didn't decide to lower your focus. You didn't consciously choose distraction. You trained it, repetition by repetition, day after day, not in extreme ways, in small, harmless moments. Checking something quickly, switching tasks for a second, filling silence with noise. Each one insignificant, together structural. And now your brain expects it. This is why you can't sit still anymore. Why deep work feels exhausting before it even starts. Why even rest doesn't feel like rest. Because real rest has no stimulation. And your brain interprets that as deprivation. So you escape it without realizing. You call it procrastination. But it's not avoidance of work. It's avoidance of low stimulation. And that changes everything. Because now the problem isn't effort. It's tolerance. Tolerance for slowness, for silence, for repetition, for delayed reward. Things that used to be normal now feel almost unbearable. And here's the paradox. The more stimulation you consume, the less satisfaction you feel. Not because there's not enough, but because your brain stopped responding the same way. So you increase it. Faster content, more scrolling, more switching. Try and feel something again. But the baseline keeps moving until one day, even things you used to enjoy feel like nothing. And that's where confusion starts. Because now it's not just productivity. It's everything. You don't feel present. Even when you're resting. Even when you're doing something you chose. There's always a background pull. A subtle urge to check, to switch, to escape. And you don't question it because it feels like you. But it isn't. It's a pattern. A loop that rewired your attention. Quietly, without asking. And now, you're living inside it. Not fully aware of when it started. Only feeling the effects. Shorter attention. Lower patience. Less depth. More noise. And the strangest part? From the outside, nothing looks wrong. That's why it continues. Because it doesn't break your life. It just flattens it. Slowly. And almost invisibly. Seeing the pattern doesn't break the pattern. That's the first contradiction. You recognize the loops. You understand the mechanism. You even predict your own behavior. And still, you repeat it, not blindly, consciously. That's what makes it unsettling. Because now it's not ignorance. It's something else. A quiet negotiation. It doesn't sound like resistance. It sounds like logic. I'll start in a minute. I just need a quick break. This won't make a difference. And in isolation, it doesn't. But the pattern doesn't live in isolated moments. It lives in sequences. One permission becomes another. One delay becomes a shift in direction until the original intention disappears. Not because you rejected it, because you drifted away from it. This drift is subtle. You don't feel like you're making a decision. You feel like you're following something natural. That's the problem. Because what feels natural is often just familiar, and your brain protects familiarity, even when it's limiting you, because familiarity reduces uncertainty, and uncertainty feels like risk. So when you try to change, the resistance doesn't block you. It redirects you towards what feels easier, towards what feels known, towards what requires less internal friction. And stimulation fits perfectly into that. It asks nothing from you. No patience, no effort, no exposure, just consumption, which is why removing it feels disproportionately hard. Not because of the activity itself, but because of what replaces it, a space. And in that space, there is no structure, no immediate reward, no clear direction, just you. And that's where most people turn back, not at the peak of difficulty, but at the absence of distraction. Because without something to react to, you're left with something unfinished. Thoughts that don't resolve instantly, tasks that require sustained attention, emotions that don't disappear on command. And your brain has been trained to avoid exactly that. So it intervenes, not loudly. It creates an urge, a small pull towards something familiar. And if you follow it, the discomfort disappears. Immediately, that's the reinforcement, not pleasure, relief. And relief is more addictive than pleasure because it feels necessary. So over time, you don't just seek stimulation. You rely on it to regulate, to escape, to not feel stuck inside your own mind. That's why discipline alone fails here, because you're not just breaking a habit. You're removing a coping mechanism. And without replacing the structure, the brain returns to what worked before. This is where most approaches go wrong. They try to eliminate the behavior without understanding its function. So the brain resists, not because it wants distraction, but because it wants stability. And here's the shift. What if the goal is not to remove the urge, but to interrupt the automatic response to it? Not stopping, interrupting. Because right now, the sequence is immediate. You feel, you act. There is no space. So nothing can change. But the moment a gap appears, even a small one, the structure starts to weaken. Not the urge, the certainty of the response. At first, the gap is almost invisible. A second of hesitation, a moment of awareness. You feel the impulse, and instead of moving instantly, there's a pause. Not forced, just noticed. And sometimes you still act. That's important, because this isn't about perfection. It's about breaking inevitability. The pattern doesn't need to disappear. It needs to lose its automatic nature. And that happens through interruption, repeated, unremarkable. You don't stop checking your phone. You just don't check it immediately. You don't eliminate distraction. You stop responding to it instantly. And that small delay changes the entire dynamic, because now the urge becomes visible. Before it was you, now it's something you experience. That separation is subtle, but structural. It creates distance. And in that distance, something new begins to form. Not discipline, agency, the ability to feel something without immediately obeying it. At first, it's unstable. The gap appears and disappears. You notice and then forget. You pause and then react. But each interruption leaves a trace, a small piece of evidence. I don't have to respond instantly. And the brain learns from evidence, not from intention. So over time, the urge doesn't disappear, but it changes position from command to suggestion. And suggestions can be ignored. Not always, but increasingly. That's where real change starts. Not when you feel different, but when the pattern stops feeling inevitable. When there is even a small moment where another path exists, and you can see it, even if you don't take it every time. Because once you see it, you can't fully go back to being automatic. And that's enough to begin. Once the pattern is no longer automatic, something unusual happens. You don't feel fixed. You feel slower, not physically, mentally. There are gaps now, moments where nothing is pulling you, no urgency, no immediate need to react. At first, this feels off because you're used to being guided by notifications, by impulses, by constant input. Now there's no clear next move, so the question appears, what do I do with this space? And this is where most people make a mistake. They try to fill it productively, more structure, more tasks, more optimization. But that recreates the same problem, because the issue was never just distraction. It was dependency on constant engagement. So instead of filling the space, you learn to stabilize inside it. This is a second shift. Not reacting was the first. Staying is the next. You sit with the absence of stimulation without rushing to replace it, not as a technique, as exposure. At first, it feels empty, then uncomfortable. And if you're here right now, where everything feels slower and a bit harder than before, this is normal. This part is difficult, not because something is wrong, but because you're no longer unconscious. Before, you escape without noticing. Now you see it and still have to sit with it. That tension is part of the process. Don't go back just because it feels uncomfortable. This is where it starts working. Then something else appears. Clarity, not sudden, not dramatic, but thoughts begin to complete themselves without interruption. You start noticing things you were skipping, patterns, ideas, decisions you've been postponing. This is what stimulation was covering, not just your attention, your depth, and now it starts returning, slowly. But this alone is not enough, because if you only remove stimulation without rebuilding direction, you drift again. So something else needs to be introduced, not intensity, structure, but a very specific kind, not rigid, not overwhelming, anchored. You choose one activity that doesn't rely on instant reward, something slightly uncomfortable, reading a few pages, writing without distraction, working on something that doesn't give feedback immediately, and you don't try to do it for long. You just return to it daily, even when it feels flat, especially when it feels flat, because this is where rewiring deepens. Your brain starts associating effort with continuity, not with stimulation, and over time, that changes what feels natural. But there's another layer most people miss. Environment. Right now, your environment is designed to remove friction. Everything is one tap away, which means every impulse is easy to satisfy. So even if your awareness improves, your surroundings keep reinforcing the old pattern. This is why willpower feels inconsistent, because you're fighting a system that was built for immediacy. So instead of relying on control, you change the conditions, not drastically. Subtly, you increase the distance between you and the impulse. Your phone is not within reach. Notifications are not constantly visible. Access is not instant. Nothing extreme, just less convenient. And that small inconvenience creates friction. The same friction you've been building internally, now supported externally, which makes the process sustainable. Because you're no longer depending only on discipline. You're reshaping the environment that shapes you. And there's one final shift, the most important one. You stop measuring progress by how little you get distracted and start measuring it by how quickly you return. Because distraction will still happen. The difference is it no longer defines the entire day. You notice it sooner. You interrupt it faster. You come back without resistance. No frustration. No internal conflict. Just return again and again. And that repetition builds identity. Not the kind you declare, the kind you experience. I can come back. That's enough, because someone who can return is no longer stuck. And over time, those returns become longer stays. Focus extends. Silence stabilizes. Depth becomes accessible again. Not because you forced it, because you removed what was fragmenting it and replaced it with something quieter. Consistency, no intensity, no extremes, just small corrections. Repeated until the mind stops searching for escape and starts tolerating presence and eventually preferring it. That's when you know the process worked. Not when everything feels easy, but when nothing feels urgent anymore and you're no longer pulled in every direction, just able to stay. If this video made you see something differently, leave a like. And if you want more content like this, subscribe to the channel. That's it.